I'm really honored to be celebrating Women's History Month with all of you today, and I feel so excited and grateful to be here to share some knowledge and ideas about the stories and challenges of women with disabilities. Now, of course, I'm only speaking for myself, but I think that what you'll find is that a lot of the themes that I'm going to talk about today might feel true for you if you're a woman with a disability that is listening to this webinar. And if you're not, if you're in a position of privilege where you don't have a disability or you don't identify as a woman, I'm hoping that some of this discussion today will open your eyes to some of the challenges that women with disabilities face as that double minority status of facing disability oppression, but also oppression related to gender inequalities. I'm really passionate about these topics, and I think that women with disabilities is definitely a population that is often left out of the history books when we look at the women's rights movement. I understand and recognize that there are many different intersections of race, ethnic identity, socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, many different intersections of marginalized status. And so I want to preface this presentation by saying that every woman with any type of marginalized identity should feel empowered and capable of speaking up and sharing your story, because your story is important. You have a voice, your story matters, and we really need more women in these conversations, in these events for Women's History Month, because you all matter. Today, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my story as a woman with a disability, and then I'll speak more broadly about the general challenges of this population. Because I'm a therapist that works with a lot of individuals with disabilities, I work with a lot of women in particular who have disabilities. And while I cannot speak for every woman with a disability, I'm hoping to share some general themes that typically are common among this demographic. So our outline today will look like this. I'll share a little bit about my story, and then we'll go into some challenges that many women with disabilities face, especially the impacts of both gender and disability. Then we'll talk about some empowerment strategies, some things that we all can do as a strong community to help empower women with disabilities. Then I'll wrap up with some final thoughts, and we'll definitely have time for questions. We have a lot to cover today, so let's dive in. I'd love to start by just sharing a little bit about my story. I have always been really passionate about empowerment, resiliency, self-improvement, growth, development, psychology. I think all of these topics have really been at the forefront of my mind through my entire life. Growing up, using a wheelchair, being diagnosed with muscular dystrophy at age 2, and then using my first wheelchair at the age of 5, I didn't really know any different. I never thought of myself as having a disability. I didn't really identify as an individual with a disability. I just thought of myself as a regular person who was going to do all of the regular things that anybody else not using a wheelchair was going to do. I was incredibly blessed with an amazing family, amazing friendships. I come from a really small town in Metro Detroit, and I was never treated differently growing up through the K-12 education system. Sure, there were things that I wasn't able to do or things that we had to adapt. I definitely needed some accommodations, but I was always an incredibly outgoing person, very social, very extroverted growing up, very ambitious, and I sort of saw myself as a natural leader. I remember as early as elementary school when I realized I had to learn how to ask for help, how to speak up, how to advocate for myself. I had to learn how to explain my needs to other people who didn't always understand me. I really had to be a strong self-advocate in order to achieve my goals. But I also realized growing up that the world has so many social systems that bring about significant barriers to women with disabilities like myself. I started noticing this when I was in high school, around the time that I was planning to go to college, and realized that it was going to be challenging for me. I had some great advisors, but a lot of people questioned my ability to live independently at college and succeed in all of the things that I wanted to do for my future. I knew that I was intelligent enough to succeed in college and have a career, but I started noticing all of the barriers that stood in my way, especially when it came to resources for some caregiving assistance, because I do require significant help with daily things, like getting out of bed in the morning, getting dressed, and navigating places in the community. During this time, I relied on a lot of help and resources, and I was able to piece together a number of different scenarios and options that allowed me to go to college at Central Michigan University on a full ride scholarship. And when I first arrived at college and then I started navigating through all the challenges of my freshman year and all the years to follow, that's when I really became aware of disability identity. That was really the first time that I was outside of my small town bubble. And I started noticing all of these social stereotypes and things like ableism. I learned about ableism and microaggressions, and I started noticing that not everyone is going to be accepting toward me or other individuals with disabilities. I also started noticing more and more inaccessibility in the community, particularly when it comes to transportation or travel. And the further that I got into adulthood, the more and more barriers that came to the forefront of my mind. I started to become really fascinated with how individuals with disabilities and other minority groups on a broader scale are able to cope in healthy ways in the face of oppression and inequality. I became really fascinated with social work and psychology, and I think I was always drawn to examining intimate relationships with ourselves and with the world around us. I took advantage of every opportunity that I had to learn and grow. I never even saw myself living independently at college, but I actually did that, and then I was able to study abroad, not just once, but 4 times during my undergraduate career. Following that, I moved over to West Michigan to pursue graduate school at Grand Valley State University. And I did a few different graduate degrees as I continued to form my own identity and navigate my career path. Now, as a psychotherapist, I work with people of all different identities and backgrounds. But in particular, I do really enjoy supporting people and families affected by disabilities or medical conditions or chronic illnesses. What I often notice is that a real barrier for women with disabilities, in particular, is an inability or lack of experience with speaking up about the injustices that they face. For example, it can be very difficult for women with disabilities to ask for accommodations in school or in the workplace. People sometimes have a lot of fear about becoming a burden to other people, and this extends far beyond accessing basic accommodations in school or in the workplace. It also affects friendships and romantic relationships. People with disabilities of all types have the same needs and the same wants as anyone else. But often, these populations, women in particular, have internalized becoming less than a whole, complete person. And that has an extraordinary impact on their confidence and their belief in their self-worth. Now, I would be lying if I said that I've never experienced these internalized feelings of being less than whole. I absolutely have. Every time people have questioned whether I fit in somewhere because of my disability, anytime people have undervalued me in an internship or in a work opportunity, I have absolutely thought about my worth as an individual with a disability. I thought about what it means to identify as a disabled person, what it means to either subscribe to the medical model of disability, where the individual is the problem, or there's a deficit or something wrong with the individual, versus the social model of disability, where it's not any deficits or problem with the individual, but rather the problem lies in society's perception of disability, right? So when we think about, I go somewhere in the community and maybe the building is not accessible for me. Well, the medical model would say it's the individual that's the problem. They're the ones living with this medical disease, and they're the ones that we need to fix. We need to do research, we need to find cures. And don't get me wrong, those things are very important, research and medical treatment. But the social model would say there's nothing wrong with the individual who is disabled. In fact, disability is a normal part of the human experience. We can normalize it. The problem, instead, according to the social model, is the building. The problem is society. The problem is the people that did not think to create that building based on universal design or a design approach that would be accessible to everyone. Probably one of the most heartbreaking things that I notice in my work with my clients who are affected by disabilities or medical conditions of any kind is that sometimes they feel as though they don't deserve the same things as those without disabilities. And of course, like I mentioned, I would be lying if I said that I didn't feel that way as well when I was growing up sometimes, especially through college. But this leads me to speak out even more about these issues. It motivates me every time I interact with a person using a wheelchair or a person with any type of disability or medical condition, and they feel like they don't deserve the same things, like they're a bother to people, like they don't fit in some way, like they shouldn't belong or that they don't belong. That really motivates me to continue working as hard as I possibly can to build mutual understanding and acceptance between those with and without disabilities. But I want to do this in a way that does not place any blame or elicit feelings of guilt from any parties involved. My mission is not to make any individual in these conversations feel a sense of guilt or privilege or shame for the ways in which their human bodies differ, including those with and without disabilities. That only drives people further apart. For example, in all of the years of my life growing up, when I have built strong friendships and relationships, I have never opened up about my disability experiences with the intention to make someone without a disability feel sorry for me. That is not my intention. And I would argue that most people with disabilities do not want others to feel sorry for them, not at all. Individuals with disabilities do not want pity. They do not want to be patronized. They do not want to be driven further apart from the rest of the population. Quite the opposite, actually. Most people with disabilities want to be included as equal citizens of the world where meaningful connections can be made. I certainly don't have all the answers for eliminating inequalities when it comes to disability or gender or any of these subjects with self-advocacy. But I do feel like it's my mission to help individuals with disabilities do the internal work that is necessary for them to confront these realities and to feel empowered and to overcome barriers and to see themselves as equal citizens of the world, as resilient people, creative problem solvers, and people that are passionate about speaking out about these issues. I also believe it's equally important to educate the community on the unique challenges of this population, all individuals with any type of disability, so that we can work toward greater inclusion and help to mitigate some of the negative impacts of social stereotypes on people with disabilities. So I'm really honored to be speaking with all of you today to celebrate a population that is sometimes left out of the history books, to celebrate Women's History Month with all of you. And I hope that the information I present today will get you thinking more about the unique challenges for women with disabilities in particular. So as mentioned earlier, women with disabilities face double oppression. They face societal assumptions and stereotypes related to the category of disability, and then they also face the gender inequalities that exist for women today. Now, of course, these are only two aspects of their identity. We also have to acknowledge that they may be facing other types of oppression related to their socioeconomic status, their race or ethnic identity, their sexuality, their religion, education level. The list goes on and on. So when we're looking at these subjects, keep in mind that I've sort of fragmented them out so that we can explore disability and then we can explore gender. But when you really conceptualize the realities of women with disabilities, we have to consider women on a case-by-case basis, looking at all of the marginalized identities that they may hold separately and then also together. So the impact of disability is absolutely widespread. Because of social inequalities, chronic misunderstandings of disability, and limited exposure to the realities of life with a disability, many people in the world have some inaccurate ideas about what it means to have a disability. And that can lead to a lot of disability stereotypes and ableism, which unfortunately only perpetrates further misunderstandings of disability. So individuals with disabilities may be perceived as less intelligent than they are. That's absolutely a devastating reality because it positions people as feeling internally less capable than they actually are. Individuals with disabilities may experience other people being uncomfortable around them, especially if non-disabled people have never been exposed to people with disabilities before. They may be uncomfortable around them. They may not know what to say or what to not say. They may not understand them very well. It may be hard for them to relate. People with disabilities may be socially excluded due to lack of inclusive practices. Individuals with disabilities may be subject to other people speaking over them. This is often true for kids or adolescents and young adults, right? When we have all these healthcare professionals and teachers and other adults, that can be really hard for our teenagers, especially, and other young adults to feel like they have a voice when they have people of authority that are speaking over them. And that's especially true for individuals with disabilities who may have additional healthcare providers or additional adults in their life that are trying to coordinate services for them. People with disabilities may also be given less information because they may be perceived as not capable of autonomy, or they may be ignored as professionals may speak to their caregivers or parents rather than the individual. Unfortunately, many people with disabilities experience oppression like this at some point in their lives, and it can take a big toll on their ability to practice self-advocacy and to follow their ambitions for success. Individuals with disabilities may feel exhausted for having to overcome these stereotypes all the time, or they may feel chronically misunderstood, they may feel isolated from the mainstream community, or they may feel like they don't have a voice because of all of these perceptions. If you experience any of these things, it makes sense that a person might lack motivation or confidence for speaking up for themselves. But rather than blaming yourself for that, if you're an individual with a disability listening to this, I really want you to remember that it's important to externalize the cause of your discomfort with speaking up. Your discomfort is probably more to do with these social stereotypes than any internal deficits on your own part. And I talk about that a lot with my clients who have disabilities. I talk about how they may have never been given an opportunity to speak up because of social oppression. They may not have felt heard from other adults in their life growing up because of their disability. And that can make it especially difficult for them to speak up and to feel empowered and to follow their aspirations as they grow up and become their own adults. If we had more time today, we could take a much deeper dive into the inequalities that individuals with disabilities face, exploring things like ableism, microaggressions, all of the different social systems that create some significant barriers for people with disabilities. But for the sake of time today, I'll ask that if you want to explore those topics further, please don't hesitate to contact me or take some time for your own research and self-reflection. Now let's take a look at the impact of gender. As we are celebrating Women's History Month, it's safe to assume that most of us recognize that women were dominated by males. We've certainly come a long way since the women's rights movement, but women are still considered a marginalized group today because certainly many gender inequalities still exist today. So I'll talk about gender socialization differences, and then I'll connect this concept to how gender stereotypes that stem from gender socialization impact women with disabilities. So beginning at birth, most families treat boys and girls very differently, and this has a profound impact on who they become. This process of gender socialization means that children grow up learning about their gender based on what their parents expect for their gender. In addition to the influence of parents, children usually prefer to play with peers who share similar interests or who they believe share those interests, and this makes them more likely to be socialized by their same gender peers. So when spending time with their friends, whether, on play dates or at school or on the playground, boys and girls learn what is appropriate for one gender or the other. So for girls, we see a lot of pink outfits, flowers, Barbie dolls, arts and crafts, playtime that includes cooking or sewing, makeup, or dresses. Girls are often expected to be quiet, to be accommodating, patient, emotional, or ladylike. Girls are often told that they're pretty or cute, often more than smart. Girls are more encouraged to talk about their emotions more than boys. Girls also receive encouragement for careers like nursing, teaching, or fashion more often than some of the science-based careers like engineering or business or other types of roles that are dominated by males. On the other hand, boys are more likely to be seen with blue outfits, camouflage, monster trucks, playtime that includes using tools or sports. Boys are often expected to be leaders, opinionated, athletic, aggressive, and protective. Boys are usually more likely to be excused for roughhousing around. You may have heard the term, boys will be boys. If they're roughhousing in the backyard or the living room, usually their behavior will be more excused than when we see girls do that. Boys are often told that they are strong, brave, or tough, and they may be told that showing emotions is for girls, so boys may be more discouraged when they do express emotions. Of course, there are exceptions to all of these, but these are just some of the patterns that are visible. And finally, boys receive encouragement for careers like business owners, doctors, or lawyers. So think about some of the gender socialization that occurred in your family. Of course, there may be some exceptions to this, but this is what is generally thought to be true and that has been studied to be true in fields like sociology, anthropology, or psychology and social work. I also want to recognize here that it's very important to honor the experiences of individuals who identify as non-binary or transgender or any other way that is gender non-conforming. In the last decade or so, our society has gained more acceptance of individuals who identify in these ways. And I want you to know that your identity and authenticity is valid. And it's really important that we listen to your narratives as well. In this conversation today, I want anyone listening who identifies as gender nonconforming in any way to know that your story is important. We need you to speak up about your realities as well and how that may differ from some of the gender stereotypes that we just went over. I also want you to know that that may be a part of your identity as a person with a disability, and your reality is equally valid as well. Like I mentioned earlier, we can all identify in all different ways, and I'm hoping that we can all have acceptance and inclusion because your authenticity is what matters most. However, for the purpose of exploring and analyzing these gender stereotypes and the patterns in which boys and girls have been socialized throughout the United States, it's really important to acknowledge that most families, certainly not all, but most families raised boys and girls very differently. And that leads to different gender stereotypes, behavior patterns, and personality differences between adult men and women. So let's talk about some of the stereotypes and the impacts that result from socializing boys and girls differently as they grow up. Well, first of all, men are usually expected to be self-confident and assertive, whereas women are expected to be accommodating, passive, and emotional. So think about how this can impact the success of women in business or in other careers. Sometimes it's important to be assertive, and that might feel really challenging for you if you struggle with self-confidence as a woman. As women, we might feel obligated to be overly accommodating. You might also feel like it's not your place to speak up. Even subconsciously, you may be more passive as a woman, and because of these stereotypes, this can have an enormous impact on your ability to pursue your ambitions as a businesswoman or in other careers where women are in the minority. Now we have to combine this with the stereotypes for individuals with disabilities. A lot of times, individuals with disabilities, like mentioned earlier, may be subject to people who have low expectations for them. So if we have these gender stereotypes combined with the other disability stereotypes that we went over, where individuals with disabilities are perceived as less intelligent, where they're not seen as autonomous individuals, where they may be perceived as a burden or as an inconvenience, as heartbreaking as that is, that can take a big toll on women with disabilities' mental health. We have to consider these mental health impacts and how it's very challenging for women who have disabilities. Let's look at another gender stereotype. Men use communication as a way to negotiate for power, as a way to seek wins, avoid failure, and offer advice, among other things. Women use communication, on the other hand, as a way to get closer to people, as a way to seek understanding, and as a way to find equality or symmetry. Now, because of these gender stereotypes, women may be more reluctant to speak up and to advocate for their equal rights and opportunities, because we might care more about hurting another person's feelings or making someone else uncomfortable than about getting our needs met in the workplace or in school or in our communities. As women, sometimes we view communication as this avenue to bond with each other, but it can be a real challenge for the purpose of achieving our goals because it limits our assertiveness and it can portray the idea that our needs are less important. I really want all of you to reflect on whether you've ever sacrificed your needs as women just to keep the conversation civil in order to avoid conflict. Another gender stereotype here. Women often have a smaller range of acceptable behaviors than men. We have this double standard here. If women are too nice, they may be judged as weak or manipulative. But if they're too aggressive, they may be judged as acting too bossy or too demanding. So because of these gender stereotypes, women may be reluctant to be confident or assertive in the workplace or in other types of leadership roles out of fear of being judged this way. So when discussing these issues with other women, one of the things that I do in my practice is try to encourage people to remember that their job is not to please everyone or concern themselves with being liked by everyone, but instead, your job should be to ensure you're getting the same respect, the same equal opportunities, and the same types of spaces to voice your ideas and opinions as a woman in the workplace or in your community. And again, I connect this to stereotypes and oppression for individuals with disabilities. Sometimes, but not always, but sometimes, individuals with disabilities are perceived as demanding or bossy when they ask for accommodations, right? It's really difficult sometimes to accept this. I have a hard time when my clients tell me this, but it's true. A lot of my clients with disabilities say that they receive backlash from non-disabled people that really don't understand why they're asking for these accommodations that they need, or they really don't understand why they're speaking up about their differences. It's hard for the non-disabled people to relate to that. Now, if we combine that stereotype and that reality of individuals with disabilities with gender oppression like this, we see that double impact. So for women with disabilities in particular, it gets really complicated. So it makes sense that a lot of women with disabilities do feel marginalized in school or in the workplace, in their communities, and sometimes even in their social circles or families. Now we're going to talk about something a bit more positive. What can we do about this? We talked about disability stereotypes, gender stereotypes, all of the double oppression that women with disabilities often face. But what can we do about this as a community as we celebrate Women's History Month? How can we find some ideas and tangible strategies for helping to empower women with disabilities in our communities? I think there's a lot of things that we can do. So first, we can uplift the voices of women with disabilities. I am really honored to be speaking here today, and I truly feel so blessed to have been able to share my story here. But there are so many other women with disabilities that also truly deserve to be recognized, and here are just a few of them. Judy Heumann. Judy Heumann is one of my role models myself. She is a wheelchair-using disability rights activist that is often left out of the history books. For more than 30 years, Judy Heumann has been an extraordinary leader in international organizations and governments around the world to advance the human rights of those with disabilities. When she was only 5 years old, she was denied the right to attend school because she was told that she was a fire hazard. Judy did not settle for this, and she decided to fight for her equal rights. She began taking major steps toward rights for people with disabilities from a young age. And by the time that she was in college, she was organizing national rallies and protests with other students with all different types of disabilities. In the 1970s, she stopped traffic in New York City by protesting on the street, and she organized rallies and communication with the media that eventually led to the passing of major legislation that granted equal rights and opportunities for people with disabilities. Judy continues to be an extraordinary leader today, and she's credited as a major influence that led to the Americans with Disabilities Act. She's also featured in the Netflix film Crip Camp. Stella Young was also an active leader in the global disability community. She was a journalist, comedian, tireless activist, and social entrepreneur. In her TED Talk, I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much, she educated and enlightened her audience about the misconceptions, objectification, and discriminatory treatment of people with disabilities. Stella Young passed away in 2014, but her legacy continues as she left an incredible mark on the world, both with her spirit and her endeavors, fighting for equal treatment of those with disabilities. Alice Wong is a disabled activist, media maker, and consultant. She is the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project, a community partnership with StoryCorps and an online community dedicated to creating, sharing, and amplifying disability media and culture. Her work is recognized globally, and she continues to make a difference in huge ways today. Sami Linton is a writer, public speaker, activist, and leader in disability studies. Her work focuses on disability arts, disability studies, and the ways that disability rights and disability justice perspectives can be amplified. She writes and speaks about internalized ableism, which is a major challenge for people with disabilities, particularly women, and one that is very rarely acknowledged. I am so proud of all of these women, all the women that have come before me, and all of the women that will come after me, and all of the ways that they're speaking out. And I think we need to have spaces and time dedicated to uplifting their voices, to talking about their stories, from reading their books to watching their media interviews. These are just some of the women with disabilities that are left out of the history books, but that really, truly deserve to be recognized. Imagine the impact that these role models can have on young girls with disabilities who are growing up using wheelchairs or who have medical conditions, chronic illnesses, learning differences, girls who are deaf or hard of hearing, girls with visual impairments. Imagine all of the disability types and all of the young girls who could be positively impacted if we can uplift the voices of more women with disabilities who are blazing trails. Beyond uplifting the voices of women with disabilities who are serving as role models, we also have to create spaces where women with disabilities in our own communities can be empowered. There are so many different spaces within our communities where we might want to think about how women with disabilities can be empowered. For example, within our social circles, this is about helping women with disabilities feel included socially, or more broadly, all individuals with disabilities. So this might involve asking friends or family members about the details of gatherings or events so that we can plan to accommodate people with disabilities who are attending those events. This might involve being able to openly discuss the unique challenges of women with disabilities with others. So talking about these topics and not shying away from these subjects. And this might involve treating all people with disabilities with respect and truly making efforts to listen to their realities and understand their lived experiences. We may also want to work to create spaces within community places, like businesses or establishments or concert venues, entertainment centers. This is about ensuring equal access to community participation. This might involve writing a letter to a restaurant owner to explain that the building is not accessible for wheelchair users. It might look like joining a local committee to represent the needs of individuals with disabilities in your city hall decisions, or speaking up in the community when you notice individuals with disabilities that are being treated unfairly. We can also make efforts within K-12 schools or on college campuses. This is about making sure that students with disabilities have equal education. Teachers and professors should be approachable for students with disabilities. Teachers and professors should also ensure classroom accommodations are in place. School advisors should be knowledgeable about supporting students with disabilities. College administrators should make sure there's accessible housing options on campus. And student club leaders and advisors should design inclusive programming so that those with disabilities can participate fully. We can also work to create inclusive spaces within our employment settings. This is about ensuring that women with disabilities are valued in the workplace. This might involve discussing workplace accommodations that can help women with disabilities thrive on the job. It might look like ensuring that there's equal access to wheelchair accessible parking, bathrooms, or other spaces. We might have to ensure that job descriptions are not written in such a way that would deter women with disabilities from applying. We might have to develop a workplace culture that allows for discussion on disability matters and, more broadly, diversity, inclusion, and respect. And finally, we may have to work on fostering healthy relationships with colleagues where women with disabilities do not feel excluded or undervalued. I think another huge strategy for helping to empower women with disabilities requires reflecting on any internal bias that you may hold. So, really take the time to process these things. Reflect on any internal bias that you may have inside and challenge your beliefs if you start to notice that internal negative thinking in your mind when it comes to including women who have disabilities. Ask yourself, do I know what ableism is? What does subtle ableism look like? What do microaggressions for people with disabilities look like? What are some examples of ableism that I have witnessed? These can be great questions to discuss in small groups within your workplace or your community. It can really get people thinking about what these concepts look like and how you have noticed them within your own thinking patterns, or maybe even notice different types of exclusion in your community. In terms of women with disabilities in particular, ask yourself if you know what gender oppression is. What do microaggressions look like for women? What are some examples of gender oppression that you have witnessed? And then ask yourself how this may impact women with disabilities. Have you ever made assumptions about women with disabilities? Have you ever felt pity for women with disabilities? Ask yourself if you've ever held low expectations for women with disabilities, or if you've ever participated in something that has diminished their voice. Ask yourself if you've been involved in anything that has excluded women with disabilities, whether unintentionally or intentionally. Ask yourself if you've ever felt uncomfortable about women with disabilities or disability in general. Why did you feel uncomfortable? What has led to your discomfort? Ask yourself where these feelings are coming from. Anytime that we can look internally and dig a little deeper and look at the way that we were raised or the experiences that we've had or maybe not have had, whether we haven't had exposure to those with disabilities, maybe we have just not explored these concepts before, or maybe because we don't experience it ourselves, maybe it's hard for you to understand. But ask yourself, what has led to this? What has led to your discomfort? Ask yourself where those feelings are coming from. Is it stereotypes, internal beliefs, misguided thoughts, past experiences? And think about, what do I need to work on? How can I work on this? A few final thoughts here before we open this up for questions. Every single person is unique and capable of living an extraordinary life. I truly believe that. Women with disabilities are more limited by social stereotypes than by their disabilities. I feel so honored to be a therapist and have clients who are women with disabilities who are working to overcome societal oppression. But we also must work as a community to challenge the stereotypes and the oppression that have caused women with disabilities to struggle in the first place. We must challenge our internal biases, speak up when we see social injustices, and work toward greater inclusiveness so that young girls with disabilities do not grow up experiencing any damaging impacts of oppression. There are so many women with disabilities who have incredible stories, and they deserve to be in the history books too. Remember to always reach out for help from a trusted adult or mental health professional if you feel like you're struggling with any of these concepts, if you feel like you're struggling with your own mental health in any way, or if you'd like to take some time and space to reflect more internally on these subjects. Now, I would love to open it up for questions. If you don't feel comfortable speaking up right now with a comment or question, my contact information is on this slide, so you are more than welcome to email me with comments or questions at any point. But I'd love to take some of your questions at this time.